Good afternoon. This is Gabe Oberfield, and I'm thrilled to be with you on the 21st at noon here on the East Coast. Delighted to have all of you with us. As always, you are joined by Kathy Purdy behind the scenes, and I am going to take you through most of the half hour that we have today. As you know, this is an opportunity for all of you to learn and to have a chance to be educated by bond attorneys, myself included, about what's happening and topical in the news and in the law that is relevant to all of you. And today we have plenty to talk about. Not just that it is unbelievably cold in New York City, but certainly all over the country there are similar downward trends of the mercury. So I know we're not alone here. And in the midst of all of that, there is much happening at federal, state, and local levels, and we look forward to catching you up. So if Kathy, you would advance to the next slide, please. Let me tell you and thank you, Kathy, what is on tap for today's program. I remind all of you that we are in 2025 working with a 30-minute format, so we will be through our programming in about half an hour from now. I will be taking a particular focus, as I've done in years past with all of you, on what happened in the year that we just left and what we might peer ahead and think about with the year to come. Right at this moment, there is an incredible amount of intrigue at federal and state levels in particular. And so I will be focusing on those activities as well as I mentioned, municipal. And so, look for, in a moment's time, some discussion of 2024 and 2025. Kristen Smith, who will be back with you next week, I expect will be following through on that theme, which we've been seeking to weave into our programming throughout the month. And then as we move into February, we will return to our standard programming, which is generally focused, as you all know, on what it is that really matters at the moment for all of you in our wisdom, and that we want to make sure that you hear about. And then after I speak, Kate Hajar, whose office is right through the wall behind mine here in New York City, we'll be speaking about Title IX. There is a lot of active movement in that space, and we want to make sure that particularly for our clients with foothold in education, whether in higher ed or even in schools prior to the higher ed crossover, that all of you are hearing about it. And for those who do not work in the higher ed and school law spaces, it's a matter of interest, certainly. I'll always make sure to save time for your questions as we close things up, and that will be at approximately 12:30 Eastern. So with that, Kathy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I will just remind everybody about some of the topics I've just addressed. Again, here in 2025, we have 30-minute webinars. I didn't flag it specifically, but let me reiterate that we will periodically have special focus programming. We did some of that last year, and we know that at least by way of your registrations and participation, it was certainly something that all of you appreciated. We saw really good turnout, and we're going to continue doing the same throughout 2025. And so, as I noted, we're going to be spending some time today looking forward and looking back. And so why don't we get started with that, please, Kathy? And so if you go to the next slide, please, Kathy, I can just walk everyone through what's happening. And of course, I approach this personally from a number of different vantage points, not only as your host here on the Tuesday webinar program, but also as the co-lead of our government and regulatory affairs practice. We are making sure that for the use and value of all of you, that we're staying on top of this information. And so what I'm going to give you today is a preview of what we will be likely diving into more deeply, including in some written pieces that are going to be coming forward from our practice group. So stay tuned, more to come there. And I also, of course, look at these issues through the lens of someone who practices in healthcare and all of the various ways in which the issues inherent in the summary are connected to healthcare. We won't spend too much time today on the healthcare specific aspects, but again, just know that there'll be more coming there, whether from me or from other members of the bond team. So just to walk you through again what we intend to tackle today. To start, I'll be summarizing the activities of President Biden as the former president closed out his term earlier this week. And of course, President Trump has returned for a second term with the change of power as of yesterday. And so we will talk about all that has happened since, and it's been quite busy. Here in New York, we, of course, happen simultaneously to be looking at what was the wrap to 24 here on the webinar. We haven't really had the time to dive into some of the bill signings and bill vetoes at the end of 24. So we want to provide that as predicate to what now is happening, which is the state of the state. That just took place a week ago. And we have reason to believe that the executive budget is going to be issued today, the proposal by the governor, that is, and that's really important. And we'll be parsing that further in the ways that I was signaling a moment ago. So with that, just know that that is some of what we're tracking. And I'm also intending to, again, touch on New York City, municipality where I'm speaking with you from, just because, a lot of what happens in New York City has resonance around the state, as we've shared with you before. So if you go to the next slide, please, Kathy, let me get started. So all of you, of course, recognize that map. Apologies to Alaska and Hawaii that didn't make the cut, but you are also part of our listening audience, perhaps. In any event, we will cover what is happening at that federal level in just a moment. So if Kathy, you would flip to the next slide, please, I appreciate it. So there you see President Biden, who, of course, stepped down yesterday. And before that happened, as is typically the case at the end of presidential terms, the president has the extraordinary power to issue pardons, which essentially eliminates criminal justice and liability for or otherwise involvement for various individuals who are the recipients of that exercise of pardon. And there were concerns that the president voiced. Again, these are the president's concerns. I'm just reporting them, concerning in specific what might happen with the Trump administration, given that then incoming President Trump and now President Trump had mentioned that certain individuals involved in investigations, including of the activities of January 6, 2021, might be subject to further scrutiny by President Trump's administration. So President Biden used discretionary authority to issue pardons to individuals, including Liz Cheney, of course, formerly a member of Congress, and formerly as well the First Lady to Vice President Cheney when Vice President Cheney was in office in the Bush administration. So that was one of among a variety of pardons, a number issued to family members of the president, including siblings of the president. That is a path that historically has not been one that presidents have walked down, but it is one that in this instance, President Biden opted to utilize. And so I mention that just because of its really unprecedented nature. And so it'll be interesting to see going forward how pardons are treated. We already have some information in terms of President Trump's approach, which I'll get to shortly in terms of some activities just yesterday. But in terms of President Biden returning to our former president, there were actions to limit offshore oil collection in the last days, additional efforts to provide relief on student loans, some activities around artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, which, let me put an asterisk here, President Trump has sought to unwind. We'll get to that shortly. There was language that was issued by the administration concerning medical debt and its connection to consumer credit reporting. President Biden sought really from a place of resolution as opposed to formal policy, calling for the Equal Rights Amendment to be formally incorporated into the Constitution. The president also commuted about 2,500 sentences for individuals with what were deemed by the president's administration to be nonviolent offenses, but for which, if they were sentenced with contemporary standards, the sentences would be far less lengthy in terms of the time of incarceration. So last a couple updates. The first concerning temporary protected status, which we know has been a subject of hot debate on both sides of the aisle over the course of the Biden administration. So that was something that President Biden sought to extend for Venezuela, El Salvador, Ukraine, and Sudan for individuals coming to the U.S. From those countries under certain circumstances. And then, of course, the president, through representatives of the administration and in a unusual partnership that represented the incoming nature of the Trump administration, as well with representatives supporting incoming President Trump. There was a ceasefire negotiated in the Israel-Hamas war. There has been some initial movement of hostages and prisoners, more there, and it's a developing story. Why don't we move to the next slide, please, Kathy? And so that was all pre-January 20th and to the wee hours of January 20th. Just yesterday, we had the exchange of power between Presidents Biden and Trump. And very quickly upon President Trump's return to office and the commencement of President Trump's second term, President Trump issued a large number of executive orders. They're fairly described as large just because it is atypical to have so many issued at once. But they affected matters including immigration and citizenship, which we will be talking about further in this webinar over time. About 80 Biden-era executive orders were canceled. Other areas addressed included diversity, equity, and inclusion, federal hiring. A lot of you may be following what has become an issue of international diplomacy and arguably national security around TikTok, which of course is a way that many people choose to interact and share information. There had been a ban instituted just in these last few days, court supported, but the Trump administration is seeking to undo that. So more to come there. And then there's the advisory group, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, which got its official start through executive order and, or at least the imprimatur of the administration, because it's not an official agency, I should be clear, but it will be one that, according to the president, will have a significant amount of advisory authority and will include individuals such as Elon Musk in terms of its leadership makeup. Also of note, yesterday, nearly all the individuals who received imprisonment and other sentences in connection with the events of January 6, 2021 at the Capitol received pardons. There is a small minority that did not, but most did, as issued by President Trump. And the president, in the midst of those executive orders I mentioned, used that tool to exit the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization, where the U.S. is being a partner to both. So let's go to the next slide, please. That, of course, will keep us all busy for these next weeks as we unpack the implications as it relates to all of you and your businesses. Some will be more immediately obvious. Others will be the subject of additional presentations by my colleagues over the coming weeks. If you look at the appointments that are being vetted right now, some of them we've talked about here before, including in my presentation remarks. Robert Kennedy Jr. Is still under consideration to lead Health and Human Services. Dr. Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, as many know him by, is still under consideration for CMS. Pete Hegseth currently television personality and a military veteran, is under department or consideration, excuse me, for the Department of Defense. An attorney general is, currently Pat Bondi's to lose, as it were. Hearings have begun, in some of these instances at Congress for those that require senatorial affirmation. So more to come here, and we will keep all of you apprised. Next slide, please. So let's move to New York State. I have just a few minutes before Kate comes on, but I want to make sure that all of you have a fuller understanding of what's happening here within not just New York City, where I speak to you from, but the broader state where many of you tune in from and are otherwise living and conducting your businesses in. So if you go to the next slide, please, Kathy, let me just remind folks what happened at the end of 2024. There were a variety of bills that Governor Hochul signed as the calendar flipped into 25. That included the Climate Change Superfund Act, the Fashion Workers Act, an AI oversight bill, tax abatements related to natural disasters, an effort to essentially liberalize access to absentee ballot activity that's consistent with what we've seen in New York in these last couple of years, where there are more ways to vote than there had been before, and that is consistent with that general pattern. Vetoed bills include the Grieving Families Act. This has been vetoed now several times by the governor, and in and of itself received a significant amount of attention. The Trees Act, the governor determined was in her discretion not appropriate to sign into law. Similarly, the Prevailing Wage of Brownfield Remediation Sites Act that was S 5868 and Assembly 749. Jury of Our Peers Act, also the governor determined was not one she felt comfortable signing. That would have allowed certain individuals with justice involvement histories to serve on juries in New York. That has not been permitted. New York is among a number of states that retains those kinds of practices. Other states have begun to shift away. Again, the governor in this instance decided not yet in New York. And there was also activity around downstate casino licensing acceleration that she said was not, in her view, appropriate. So she used the veto pen. Next slide, please, Kathy. In the State of the State, which took place a week ago, the governor focused on a variety of themes for all of those who took part in the speech, either in the room or remotely. It was one with a lot of effort to bring sort of joy and enthusiasm. And what the governor talked about at very high levels in that speech were public safety initiatives, mental health initiatives, some involving the intersection of mental health and public safety, and also issues affecting youth in New York State. She looked at consumer protection and affordability, housing, energy, among other issues. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, we get into the proverbial meat and potatoes of all of this, because the governor, as I mentioned, is set to release her budget proposal, which will be the subject of negotiation for these next months with the Assembly and Senate. We expect that there'll be about 10 billion, excuse me, with a B, that would be folded into the budget this year if the governor's proposal goes forward without change. That would be up from the 239 last year. That was itself slightly adjusted to 243 mid-year. And then there'll be, we expect within the bills, which will ultimately be dropping and the language to be reviewed, there will be calls for tax cuts, a child care credit, which, by the way, the governor mentioned in the State of the State, an inflation refund check for certain individuals in the state, meals for certain public schoolers, enhanced subway security, which connects up with that note I was mentioning concerning mental health, and a school cell phone ban, which actually we've talked about here on the webinar before, because there had been a bill that was circulating around this. So it's likely to make it within the budget itself. And then other questions that we have include whether we're going to see the MCO tax, which I mentioned 2 weeks ago, essentially about $2 billion through an accounting tool as between the federal government and New York are likely to be flowing in. There is some talk that could be a target of the current Trump administration. So we'll see whether that remains and to what degree the governor counts on it in her budget calculations. Similarly, congestion pricing is a very active topic. More on that in a moment, and that may have connection to what it is that the budget all in looks like. And the 1115 waiver amendment, I've talked about it on this program before. It's several billion dollars of money is focused on health-related social needs. The work has begun. It's federal and state combined funding that will have a big effect on the healthcare budget. That also, because of the change in federal administrations, theoretically could be under review and potentially reduced. The likelihood of that is probably a lot lower. So more on that as we get deeper into 25. Next slide, please. So here in New York City, if you go to the next slide after that, please, Kathy. As I mentioned, we have congestion pricing. That shot to the right is outside of my window here. I provided one a few months ago. It was far more packed with cars a few months ago. From an anecdotal vantage point here in Midtown Manhattan, congestion pricing is definitely reducing traffic. But what the effects are still unfurling because, of course, it just went into effect earlier this month. There are public statements around how money is generated from the tax, or rather from the tolls, I should say, forgive me, will be connected to the expansion of the Second Avenue subway north of here in Manhattan. President Trump has stepped in personally. As you know, of course, President Trump spent most of his life here in New York and has called for its discontinuation. So New York remains a focal point for the president, and there is ongoing resistance and pushback. So we shall see, I guess, is the best way to describe it. But it's a big ticket item and important for all of you to have awareness of as it relates to what does and doesn't get funded in our state here in New York. Next slide, please. Finally, before I turn over to Kate, let me just quickly note that Eric Adams here in New York City issued a preliminary budget on the 16th, and that's a $114.5 billion budget. It will go through a cycle of negotiation with the city council, mirroring in many respects what's happening at the state level. That negotiation process will wind down by July 1, with the heaviest activity happening in June. More on that, certainly, as it relates to all of you. Many of you we know have business interests in New York City, so we want to keep you apprised. And with that, let me quickly then flip to our next speaker, who is going to be Kate Hajar, as I mentioned. Kate is here to talk about Title IX and the Title IX final rule being struck down. Hugely important to our clients in higher education and school law generally. Kate, of course, is part of our New York City office, a member who focuses in her practice on higher education, among other areas, labor law, et cetera, and has really useful perspective on this. So Kate, please go right ahead. Thank you very much for taking the time to catch us all up.
Thank you, Gabe, very much. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back on the webinar with you all to discuss briefly yet another example of regulatory whiplash in this area, although perhaps not totally unexpected. Many of you may be aware, and Kathy, we can go to the next slide, that on January 9th of this year, the Eastern District of Kentucky held in State of Tennessee versus Cardona that the U.S. Department of Education's 2024 Title IX regulations were unlawful. This has nationwide effect, which means that as we sit today, the 2024 regulations are no longer in effect. This, of course, is not the first time that the 2024 rules have been challenged. Even before the January 9th decision out of the Eastern District of Kentucky, several courts had issued injunctions, which resulted in the 2024 regulations not being in effect in many states, 26 states, and even a multitude of additional individual colleges and universities across the country. the court took issue in state of Tennessee, just for some background information, that the final rule, the 2024 final rule, suffered from several fatally lethal defects, fatal legal defects. The first being that its definition of sex went beyond what Title IX contemplated originally, that the inclusion of gender identity was beyond what Title IX's definition of sex contemplated. Its definition of sex-based harassment was also overly broad, and the scope of the rule's jurisdiction was also legally fatal, according to the Eastern District of Kentucky. All of these elements effectively violating the First Amendment, the Spending Clause, and as the court says, were arbitrary and capricious. The 2024 final rule was, of course, part of the Biden administration's Title IX agenda, which the Trump administration was expected to revisit and reverse. So that's why I say this is not totally unexpected. The timing of the change, however, the timing of this decision coming prior to the new administration taking office and without any associated notice or rulemaking process, does add a layer of confusion and perhaps leave complexity to the effect of this case and how it's going to affect institutions nationwide. So what do we do? As of today, like I said, the 2024 regulations are no longer in effect, so institutions will need to revert to a practice that is compliant with 2020. That doesn't necessarily mean that all aspects of your 2024 policies and procedures need to be thrown out. There are some institutions, for example, that opted to keep a live hearing model with cross-examination under the 2024 Title IX regulations. That can be kept because it is the required model pursuant to the 2020 regulations. The 2024 regulations also afforded greater protections, explicit protections for pregnant students, including accommodations for pregnant students. And while those aspects of the 2024 regulations are no longer going to be enforced, there's nothing in the 2020 version of the regulations that would necessarily make every element of those pregnancy-related protections illegal. So there are a lot of questions that we're still working through. There are intricacies that need to be considered well beyond the brief examples that I gave you. Some of the questions that institutions will need to consider is how to handle pending cases. These are cases that were started either because they were under investigation or being adjudicated prior to the January 9th decision. Under what policy and in what way do we handle those cases? The impact of state and local laws are also going to, come into play here in New York State. We have in New York City as well have very robust human rights statutes that afford many of the protections that were under the 2024 Title IX regulations. So those are still in effect, and the interplay now of those laws with the 2020 standards is going to be a complicated dynamic. And for those reasons, it's going to be important that you consult with counsel as you're working through this period of change. Private institutions, of course, historically have always been granted some degree of latitude to develop their own policies and procedures. And, they are going to have more leeway than public institutions are in this area. I note that one of President Trump's executive orders yesterday declared that there is only going to be a gender binary of male and female in the public sector, in the government setting. What impact that is going to have in this space is still somewhat of a question. But we do expect that there's going to be guidance coming from the new administration's Department of Education, which may help institutions gain some greater clarity in terms of what the Department of Education's expectations are in this space. And we fully anticipate that there will be more litigation in this area. So this is an important topic, much to discuss. It is a nuanced topic. So we are available if questions are coming up on your campuses to help you work through those questions at this time. So we are at 12:30. So I will say thank you, Gabe, very much for the invitation, the opportunity to really just do a quick introduction on this topic that we could be talking about for many minutes.
Indeed. And in most of the areas that you and I covered, what we're doing is scraping the edge of the proverbial iceberg. And there is just much more depth that over the coming weeks, we expect to bring to a number of these topics, which again, really are connected so deeply to this audience and its businesses and other activities, whether at New York state or federal levels. So Kate, I hope that, as this Title IX set of issues, matures and is a little bit more thoroughly defined, you'll come back on the program. Thank you for this update. And to all of you, as Kate pointed out, it is 12:30, so we are at time. We thank all of you for taking the time to be part of the program today. You'll be led next week by Kristen Smith, and I know she'll make sure to give you all of the updates that will be relevant and important. By then, we'll certainly know, for instance, more about the governor's executive budget proposal. So stay tuned. In the interim, we thank you for your loyalty to the program. You can always contact me personally if you have questions or concerns. In the meanwhile, stay warm and safe out there, and we'll see you next week.